There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a small American town when something goes wrong inside one of its most trusted institutions. It is not the silence of ignorance. It is the silence of people who know something is not right but have decided, each for their own private reasons, that saying so out loud is a luxury they cannot afford. It is the silence of mortgage payments and school tuitions and the quiet fear of being the next one standing in the parking lot with a cardboard box. It is the silence that protects the wrong people and punishes the right ones. And it is the silence that Sandra Kowalski, a veteran nurse working in the flat, oil-rich desert of West Texas, refused to keep. What happened to her because of that refusal? What was done to her by the people she had served alongside for years, by the institution she had given the best part of her professional life to, by the legal system she had been taught to believe would protect people like her, became one of the most shocking and important medical whistleblower stories in the history of American healthcare. And the full weight of it, every detail, every betrayal, every consequence, every hard-won moment of vindication, is what we are going to walk through together today. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because we cover stories like this one every single week. To understand why this story matters as much as it does, you have to first understand the world it took place in. Kermit, Texas, in the late 2000s, was a town of just over 5,000 people. It sat in Winkler County, in the far western corner of the state, where the Permian Basin oil fields stretched in every direction and the landscape was so flat and so wide that the horizon felt like the edge of a different world. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where your doctor was also your neighbor, where your sheriff was someone you had gone to school with or hunted with or attended church alongside, where the social fabric was tight enough that pulling on one thread had the potential to unravel things that people had spent decades carefully holding together. Winkler County Memorial Hospital was the only hospital for miles in any direction. It served the entire county. It was not a large or prestigious facility by any national measure, but in the lives of the people who depended on it, it was everything. It was where babies were born and where the elderly came when they had nowhere else to go. It was where oil field workers were taken after accidents. It was where families sat in waiting rooms and trusted, with the particular profound trust that sick and frightened people extend, that the people behind those doors knew what they were doing and were doing it right. Sandra Kowalski had been part of that trust for a long time. She had built her career at Winkler County Memorial Hospital across more than 2 decades. She had started as a floor nurse and worked her way into a compliance officer role, a position that carried real institutional weight and real professional responsibility. As compliance officer, it was literally Sandra's job to identify practices that fell below standard, to document concerns, to ensure that the hospital was operating within the bounds of the law and within the ethical standards that the nursing profession demanded. She was not a gossip. She was not someone who looked for problems where none existed. She was someone who had spent her entire adult life inside the healthcare system and who understood, with a clarity that comes only from years of direct patient care, what the difference looked like between acceptable and unacceptable, between a bad outcome and a preventable one, between a physician having a difficult day and a physician doing things that should never be done. Her closest colleague in those years was Patty Okafor. Patty was the hospital's quality assurance officer, which meant she sat in a professional position adjacent to Sandra's, both of them responsible, in different but complementary ways, for ensuring that the care being provided at that hospital met the standards it was supposed to meet. Patty was thoughtful and careful, the kind of person who gathered all available information before arriving at a conclusion. She did not alarm easily. She did not exaggerate. When Patty Okafor told you something was wrong, you could be confident that she had looked at it from every angle before she said so. And so when Sandra and Patty began, independently and then together, to develop serious concerns about a physician who had joined the hospital's medical staff, those concerns carried the weight of 2 experienced, credentialed, professionally responsible women who were doing the jobs they had been hired to do. The physician at the center of their concern was Dr. Richard Harlan. Dr. Harlan had arrived at Winkler County Memorial Hospital carrying what appeared, on the surface, to be a reasonable professional record. He was personable. He was willing to practice in a rural Texas town that many physicians would have passed over in favor of larger, better-resourced facilities. In a county with only a handful of doctors serving thousands of patients, his willingness to be there counted for something. Hospital Administrator Gerald Moss had brought him on board and was, by most accounts, invested in making things work with Dr. Harlan. The community needed doctors. The hospital needed to maintain its medical staff. And Dr. Harlan, at least initially, appeared to fill that need. What nobody discussed openly, what sat beneath the surface of Dr. Harlan's professional presentation like a fault line waiting to shift, was the fact that the Texas Medical Board had already placed restrictions on his medical license before he ever walked through the doors of Winkler County Memorial Hospital. Those restrictions had not been disclosed to the hospital's patient population. They had not been prominently addressed in the credentialing process in the way that they should have been. And so patients came to Dr. Harlan trusting that the system had vetted the person treating them. That trust was misplaced. Sandra and Patty became aware of concerns about Dr. Harlan's practice soon after he arrived. The concerns were not vague or impressionistic. They were specific, documented, and deeply troubling to anyone with a clinical background. Dr. Harlan was known within the hospital for his enthusiasm for alternative medicine, herbal remedies, unconventional treatments, approaches that had no basis in peer-reviewed medical science and no approval from the Food and Drug Administration. He had been emailing patients from a hospital clinic and encouraging them to purchase herbal supplements that he recommended, supplements that were not on the hospital's approved formulary, that the hospital had no control over, and that patients were paying for out-of-pocket based on the recommendation of someone they trusted to give them medically sound advice. This alone was deeply problematic, but it was far from the most serious thing Sandra and Patty had observed. There was the case of a patient who came to the emergency room with a crushed finger, in pain, trusting the man in the white coat to fix it properly. Dr. Harlan's solution, documented and later confirmed by the Texas Medical Board in formal proceedings, was to take the rubber tip off a pair of medical scissors from a suture kit and stitch it onto the patient's damaged finger. A rubber tip, from a pair of scissors, stitched onto a human being's hand. Dr. Harlan would later claim he was attempting to stabilize a fracture. The Texas Medical Board, after full investigation, did not find that explanation satisfactory, and any nurse with Sandra's level of experience looking at that case would not have found it satisfactory either. This was not an unconventional approach to a difficult problem. This was not innovative medicine practiced in a resource-limited environment. This was something that should never have happened in any hospital, anywhere, under any circumstances. Then there was the patient admitted with a serious bacterial infection, a methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus abscess, which any clinician will tell you is one of the more dangerous and difficult infections a patient can present with, precisely because standard antibiotics do not work against it, and the consequences of inadequate treatment can be severe and swift. Dr. Harlan's treatment for this patient's MRSA abscess was to rub an olive oil solution on it. Olive oil, not approved by the FDA for this purpose, not on the hospital's formulary, not supported by any peer-reviewed clinical evidence. Olive oil, rubbed on a serious bacterial infection, in a hospital, by a licensed physician, while a patient trusted that they were receiving appropriate medical care. Sandra knew what MRSA could do to a patient who was not treated correctly. She had seen it. Every experienced nurse had seen it. And what she was seeing Dr. Harlan do, or more precisely, what she was seeing him fail to do, was not a matter of philosophical difference about treatment approaches. It was a matter of patient safety. Real, immediate, measurable patient safety. There was also the matter of a skin graft performed on an emergency room patient, a procedure that requires specific surgical credentials and surgical privileges at the facility where it is performed. Dr. Harlan, according to the documentation that eventually emerged, was not credentialed to perform surgery at Winkler County Memorial Hospital. He did not have the surgical privileges that procedure required, and yet he performed it. There were also reports of Dr. Harlan attempting to use hospital supplies to perform at-home medical procedures on patients, using the resources of an institutional healthcare facility for private, unsupervised clinical activity that the hospital had no oversight of and no ability to monitor. The Texas Medical Board would eventually identify 9 separate instances of substandard care in its formal charges against Dr. Harlan. 9. But before any of that happened, Before any regulatory body took any formal action, two nurses at a small hospital in West Texas were the only people standing between Dr. Harlan's patients and whatever came next. Sandra did not go directly to the Texas Medical Board when she first developed concerns. That is an important detail, and it says something essential about who she was and how she operated. She went internally first. She raised her concerns through the hospital's own channels, the way every compliance training program and professional code of ethics tells healthcare workers to do. She spoke to people in administration. She brought her observations forward. She made clear, in the professional and documented way that her compliance officer role required, that there were things happening on the medical staff that she believed needed to be addressed. The response she received was not an investigation. It was not a thank you. It was not even a serious conversation about what she had observed. What she received, instead, was the institutional equivalent of a closed door. Her concerns were noted and set aside. The message, delivered with the particular corporate fluency that administrators use when they want to communicate something they cannot actually say out loud, was that Dr. Harlan was a member of the medical staff, that his contributions to the hospital were valued, and that the concerns Sandra was raising were not going to be acted upon in any meaningful way. The hospital had made its calculation, and Sandra Kowalski was not the variable it had chosen to protect. This is the moment in a story like this one where everything depends on character. Because at this point, Sandra had done what she was supposed to do. She had raised the concern. She had been rebuffed. She could have walked away. She could have told herself that she had done her part, that she had spoken up through the proper channels, that the responsibility now rested with the people who had the authority to act. Many people, faced with that same situation, would have made exactly that choice. It would have been a reasonable choice. It would have been a self-protective choice. And the patients who continued to see Dr. Harlan would have continued to be exposed to whatever his next decision was. Sandra Kowalski was not able to make that choice. Not because she was reckless, or because she had a personal grievance, or because she was looking for a fight, but because she was a nurse. Because she had spent more than 20 years believing, in the most foundational way, that the patient came first. That the obligation to the person in the bed was not conditional on whether the institution supported it. That the oath she had taken when she entered this profession did not come with an asterisk that read "except" when it might cost you your job. She talked to Patty. They sat together with the weight of what they knew and the weight of what they were considering doing about it, and they made a decision together that was one of the most consequential of either of their lives. They would write a formal complaint to the Texas Medical Board. They would document everything, the cases, the specific incidents, the pattern of behavior they had observed across multiple patients. They would do it properly, completely, with the clinical specificity that their professional backgrounds allowed. And they would do it anonymously, because they understood the environment they were in. Because the letter itself, before it was even sent, acknowledged what they feared. Sandra and Patty wrote in their complaint that they were hesitant to attach their names to the information, because the hospital administration had made it clear that there would be no reporting of any problems without first notifying administration, the medical staff, and the board. They wrote that this policy would certainly create an opportunity for the administrator to remove them from employment. They knew exactly what was at risk. And they sent the letter anyway, in April of 2009, addressed to the Texas Medical Board, containing detailed concerns about the care of 9 specific patients. They sent it anonymously because the law was supposed to protect that anonymity. Because medical board complaints, submitted in good faith by healthcare workers who feared retaliation, were supposed to be confidential. Because they had followed the rules, and the rules were supposed to follow them back. The Texas Medical Board received the letter and did what regulatory bodies do. They contacted Dr. Richard Harlan and informed him that a complaint had been filed against him. This is standard procedure. It is how the process works. Dr. Harlan was entitled to know that he was the subject of a complaint and to have the opportunity to respond to it. What he was not entitled to do was use that knowledge as the starting point for a personal campaign to identify and destroy the people who had reported him. But that is exactly what he did. Dr. Harlan went to Sheriff Dale Cooper. Sheriff Cooper was not simply a professional acquaintance of Dr. Harlan's. He was a friend, a patient, a man who had received care from Dr. Harlan and who had, in the way that people in small towns sometimes do, developed a personal loyalty to the physician that went well beyond the clinical relationship. When Dr. Harlan told Sheriff Cooper that someone at the hospital had filed a malicious, false complaint against him to ruin his reputation, Sheriff Cooper did not step back and consider whether a county law enforcement officer had any business involving himself in a medical board matter involving a personal friend. He did not identify the profound conflict of interest that should have stopped him cold. He listened to Dr. Harlan's complaint, and he opened an investigation. What followed was a sequence of events that the Texas Attorney General's office would later describe in terms that left no ambiguity about what had actually occurred. Sheriff Cooper, armed with information from Dr. Harlan about the patients referenced in the complaint, approached the Texas Medical Board and obtained a copy of the anonymous complaint through what court records would describe as deception. He used the patient information that Dr. Harlan had provided, information that Dr. Harlan had access to through his clinical role, to help trace the complaint back to its source. He then took what he had learned to Tom Siebert, the county prosecutor, a man who would make the decision that transformed a physician's private vendetta into an official act of government. Tom Siebert, the elected district attorney of a Texas county, took the evidence that a sheriff had gathered at a doctor's request through deceptive means, and he presented it to a grand jury. And that grand jury, in June of 2009, handed down felony indictments against Sandra Kowalski and Patty Okafor. Third-degree felony, misuse of official information. The same charge, carrying the same potential sentence of 2 to 10 years in a Texas prison that you might face for bribery, for tampering with evidence, for a range of serious criminal acts. 2 nurses, for writing a letter to a medical board about a doctor they believed was harming patients. Gerald Moss, the hospital administrator, did not wait for the legal proceedings to develop before acting. He fired Sandra and Patty before the indictments were even formally issued. In the early summer of 2009, ending careers of over 20 years at the institution both women had served with genuine dedication. The official reasons given were consistent with how institutions always handle these situations, vague enough to be legally defensible, specific enough to cause professional damage. Sandra walked out of Winkler County Memorial Hospital for the last time, carrying her personal belongings. She had reported a doctor she believed was endangering patients. She had done it through proper channels first, then through a regulatory body specifically designed to receive such reports. She had done it anonymously because the law said she had that right. And she had been fired, indicted on a felony charge, and was facing a future in which the career she had built across more than 2 decades could be permanently destroyed, alongside the very real possibility of a prison sentence. The American Nurses Association called the prosecution outrageous. State nursing associations across the country rallied around Sandra and Patty, recognizing immediately what was at stake. Not just for these 2 women, but for every nurse in America who had ever considered reporting a physician for unsafe practice. Because if Sandra Kowalski could be indicted for writing a letter to a medical board, then every nurse who had ever picked up a pen to do the same thing was potentially vulnerable. The message being sent, deliberately or not, was unmistakable: stay quiet or face this. And the people sending that message held all the institutional power in that moment. The doctor, the sheriff, the hospital administrator, the county prosecutor, all the weight of official authority, all the credentialing and the titles and the offices and the uniforms, arrayed against 2 women in nursing scrubs whose only weapon was a carefully documented letter and the knowledge that what they had written was true. Sandra retained Carol Reyes as her attorney. Carol Reyes was the kind of lawyer who understood that the case in front of her was not really about misuse of official information. It was about whether the legal system that was being used as a weapon against her client could be turned around and pointed back at the people who had wielded it. Carol was methodical, thorough, and completely clear-eyed about what they were dealing with. She understood that the whistleblower protection laws that existed in Texas were real but imperfect, that the road ahead was going to be long and expensive, and that the institutional resources on the other side of this fight were vastly greater than anything Sandra had available to her. None of that deterred Carol Reyes. She began building 2 parallel tracks simultaneously: a criminal defense for the charges Sandra faced, and a civil lawsuit that would eventually name Dr. Harlan, Sheriff Cooper, Gerald Moss, Tom Siebert, and the county itself as defendants. The criminal case came first. The charges against Patty Okafor were eventually dropped before trial. The prosecutor apparently determined that the case against her was not strong enough to take to a jury. But Tom Siebert pressed forward with the case against Sandra. He argued, in the manner of prosecutors who have committed to a theory they cannot easily abandon, that Sandra's letter to the Texas Medical Board had been motivated not by genuine patient safety concerns, but by a personal vendetta against Dr. Harlan. That she had used her access to official patient information for a non-governmental purpose, specifically, to harm the reputation of a colleague she disliked. The case was moved out of Winkler County because finding an impartial jury in a community of 5,000 people where everyone knew everyone involved was simply not possible. It was moved to Andrews County, the neighboring county, where a jury of 12 ordinary Texans was seated and a 4-day trial began in February of 2010. Those 4 days were, by every account, a comprehensive presentation of everything that had led to this moment. The letter, the patients had described, the specific incidents of care that Sandra and Patty had documented, the timeline of events from the moment the medical board contacted Dr. Harlan to the moment the indictments came down. The jury heard about the rubber tip from the scissors stitched onto a patient's finger. They heard about the olive oil rubbed on the MRSA abscess. They heard about the skin graft performed without surgical credentials. They heard about the herbal supplements being sold to patients. They heard about the hospital's internal policy that discouraged nurses from reporting concerns to outside agencies without first obtaining administrative approval, a policy that the Texas Nurses Association had already identified as a violation of the nurses' rights under the Texas Nursing Practice Act. They heard about everything, and then they went to deliberate. They were back in less than an hour. Not guilty. Not guilty. After 4 days of testimony and evidence. After everything that had been done to Sandra Kowalski across the preceding year, the firing, the indictment, the public accusations of malice and personal vendetta, the felony charge that could have sent her to prison for a decade. The jury of 12 ordinary Texans took less than 60 minutes to look at the full picture and reach a verdict. What had been done to Sandra was not criminal. What had been done to Sandra, the jury's swift and unambiguous decision communicated, was wrong. Outside the courthouse, Carol Reyes told the gathered press that while she was relieved by the verdict, the relief was incomplete. The damage done to Sandra and to Patty could not be undone by a courtroom decision. Years of their careers had been disrupted. They had lived with the weight of felony charges hanging over them. They had paid legal fees and faced public accusations and experienced the particular psychological toll of being labeled criminals for the act of caring about their patients. A not guilty verdict was the right outcome. It was not full justice. Not yet. But the machinery of real accountability had already begun moving. In the months following Sandra's acquittal, multiple threads of consequence began running simultaneously toward the people who had orchestrated what had been done to her. The Texas Medical Board, whose investigation had continued throughout the criminal proceedings, filed formal charges against Dr. Richard Harlan, 9 counts of substandard care, the same cases that Sandra and Patty had documented in their original letter, now confirmed through the board's own independent investigation. The charges included poor medical judgment, non-therapeutic prescribing, failure to maintain adequate medical records, overbilling, and witness intimidation. Every concern that Sandra had raised, every specific incident that she had documented with the meticulous care of someone who knew her word would be questioned, had been validated by the regulatory body whose entire function was to evaluate exactly these kinds of claims. In August of 2010, before the full weight of criminal consequences had landed on Dr. Harlan and his allies, Sandra and Patty's civil lawsuit reached its conclusion. The defendants, Dr. Harlan, Sheriff Cooper, Gerald Moss, Tom Siebert, and the county, agreed to settle. The total amount was $750,000, $375,000 each, paid to 2 nurses who had done nothing more than report a physician to the appropriate regulatory authority through the appropriate legal channel. When reporters asked Sandra about the settlement, her response said everything about who she was and what had really driven her through all of it. She said, simply and directly, "This has never been about the money. Because these situations are never about money. It's about good care." That was it. That was the entire motivation. Good care. The patients. The people in the beds. The people who had no idea that the physician treating them was operating without proper credentials, using unapproved treatments, stitching rubber tips onto injured fingers, and rubbing cooking oil on serious bacterial infections. Good care. That was what Sandra Kowalski had put her career, her freedom, and her financial stability on the line for. Good care. The criminal consequences for the men who had used their positions and their power to destroy her came in waves. Gerald Moss, the hospital administrator who had fired Sandra and Patty with such efficient speed, pleaded guilty in March of 2011 to a misdemeanor charge of abuse of official capacity. He was sentenced to 30 days in jail and agreed to testify against the others involved in the case. 30 days. For a man who had taken away the livelihoods of two experienced nurses who had done their jobs exactly as those jobs were supposed to be done. Sheriff Dale Cooper, the lawman who had used his badge and his office to unmask a confidential medical complaint as a favor to a personal friend, faced his own legal reckoning. Tom Siebert, the prosecutor who had decided that filing felony charges against patient advocates was an appropriate use of his authority and the public's trust, faced consequences for that decision. The full weight of what each of these men had done, what they had set in motion when they collectively decided that protecting Dr. Richard Harlan mattered more than the truth, came back to them. And then there was Dr. Harlan himself. In December of 2010, Dr. Richard Harlan was arrested by officers of the Texas Attorney General and charged with 2 third-degree felonies, misuse of official information and retaliation against the nurses who had reported him. The same charges, carrying the same potential prison sentences that had been used against Sandra. The irony was not lost on anyone who had been following the case. In November of 2011, Dr. Harlan pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to 1 count each of misuse of official information and retaliation. He received a deferred adjudication, meaning his record would be cleared if he complied with the terms of his probation, along with a $5,000 fine. 3 days before his guilty plea, he had surrendered his medical license to the Texas Medical Board, the license he had used to practice medicine in that hospital, the license that had carried the weight of official sanction, the weight that had made Sandra's concerns so easy to dismiss and so dangerous to voice. Gone. Surrendered. Because the 2 nurses he had tried to destroy had been right all along. The hospital itself was fined $15,850 by the state as an administrative penalty for its violations of Texas law, specifically for the policy it had maintained that prohibited nurses from reporting patient care concerns to outside agencies without first obtaining the hospital's permission. The Texas Nurses Association, which had stood with Sandra and Patty from the earliest days of the case, had filed a formal complaint about that policy, correctly identifying it as a violation of nurses' rights under the Texas Nursing Practice Act. The fine was modest relative to the harm the policy had caused, but the principle it established, that hospitals cannot legally prohibit their nurses from reporting patient safety concerns to regulatory authorities, carried consequences that extended far beyond Winkler County. Because that is what this case ultimately became. It became a reference point, a landmark, a story that nursing schools started teaching as a case study in patient advocacy and institutional retaliation, a story that medical ethics courses assigned because it illustrated, with terrible clarity, exactly what happens when an institution chooses its reputation over its patients and uses the mechanisms of law enforcement and employment law to punish the people who said so. The Texas Nurses Association worked in the immediate aftermath of this case to push for legislative changes at the state level that would strengthen protections for healthcare whistleblowers, to ensure that what had been done to Sandra and Patty could never be done to another nurse in Texas again, without clear, specific, enforceable legal consequences. National nursing organizations pointed to the case as evidence that the existing patchwork of whistleblower protections across the country was inadequate, that a nurse in any state could, under the right circumstances and the wrong administrator, face what Sandra had faced. And they were right, because the specific combination of factors that made what happened in Kermit, Texas, possible, a physician with powerful friends, an administrator invested in protecting institutional reputation, a sheriff willing to abuse his authority, and a prosecutor willing to weaponize the criminal justice system, was not unique to a small West Texas oil town. Those conditions exist, in varying degrees, in healthcare systems everywhere. Sandra Kowalski eventually found her way back into nursing. It was not easy, and it was not fast. In rural Texas, healthcare jobs were not plentiful. Her name had been publicly connected to a criminal prosecution, And even after her acquittal, even after the civil settlement, even after every person who had moved against her had faced some form of consequence, the professional disruption that had been inflicted on her did not simply reverse itself because justice had been served. She had to rebuild. She had to find an institution willing to look at her record and see an experienced, principled, courageous compliance officer rather than a nurse who had been criminally charged. She did eventually find that institution. She did eventually return to the work she had never stopped believing in. But the years in between, the legal proceedings, the financial strain, the isolation, the professional uncertainty, those years do not get refunded. There is no mechanism in the law, no settlement large enough, no guilty plea satisfying enough to give a person back the years that were taken from them. Patty Okafor's path after the case was similarly difficult. Both women found, as many whistleblowers do, that being publicly and completely vindicated does not automatically translate into the professional restoration you deserve. The damage that institutional retaliation inflicts on a career is not always reversible, even when the retaliation itself is thoroughly exposed and punished. News accounts from the years following the case noted that both women struggled to find good jobs in their field in rural Texas, where healthcare positions were limited and where their names were still associated, in the minds of some potential employers, with controversy rather than courage. This is one of the quieter but more devastating aspects of whistleblower retaliation. Even after it has been definitively proven that you were right and the people who came after you were wrong, the professional cost of having been in the middle of that fight does not simply disappear. It follows you. And the people who inflicted it on you have often moved on before the full weight of that cost is fully felt. What the case of Sandra Kowalski and Patty Okafor left behind was a changed conversation. Not a perfect one. Not one that has resolved all the questions it raised, but a different one than existed before. The question of what it means to protect a healthcare whistleblower, what that protection should look like, how it should be enforced, what consequences should follow for those who violate it, is now a more serious question in American healthcare law than it was before two nurses in Kermit, Texas, decided that the patients in their hospital mattered more than their own professional safety. The specific absurdity of what had been done to them. The use of a felony statute designed to protect the integrity of government information, twisted into a weapon against two nurses for submitting a medical board complaint, exposed a gap in the legal framework that had not previously been clearly identified. No state in the country, at the time this case developed, had whistleblower laws that specifically addressed the question of whether a prosecutor could be held accountable for bringing a retaliatory criminal case against a healthcare whistleblower. Texas moved to address that gap in the aftermath of this case. Other states took note. And yet, for all of the legislative progress, all of the policy conversations, all of the case studies and the law school syllabi, and the nursing association reforms, the fundamental dynamic that made this story possible has not been eliminated from American healthcare. Physicians still hold more institutional credibility than nurses in most hospital environments. Administrators still face institutional incentives that can work against the transparent investigation of medical staff misconduct. Whistleblower protection laws are still imperfect, still inconsistently enforced, still dependent on the willingness of individual people to absorb enormous personal cost in exchange for the possibility of eventual vindication. And the nurses who sit in break rooms across this country, late at night, writing in notebooks, noticing patterns that their supervisors have told them are not there. Those nurses still have to make the same calculation that Sandra Kowalski made in the spring of 2009. They have to decide whether the truth is worth what telling it might cost them. Every single day. In hospitals you have been to. In hospitals your family members are in right now. Sandra Kowalski decided it was worth it. Patty Okafor decided it was worth it. And the patients who were protected by that decision. The ones who came to that hospital after Dr. Richard Harlan was no longer there, after his license was gone, after every person who had shielded him had faced a consequence. Those patients will never know their names. Will never know that the safety they received when they walked through those doors was purchased by two women who paid a price for it that no one should ever have had to pay. That is the story. And I want to leave you with the question that I have not been able to stop thinking about since I first came across it. Not the question of whether justice was served, though that is worth sitting with. Not the question of whether the consequences were proportionate to what was done, though that is worth sitting with too. The question I keep coming back to is this. How many hospitals in this country, right now, have a policy like the one Winkler County Memorial Hospital had? A policy that tells nurses, explicitly or implicitly, that they must get permission before reporting a patient safety concern to a regulatory authority? How many nurses are sitting with something they know, something they have documented, something they are afraid to say out loud because they have watched what happened to Sandra Kowalski and they have decided, rationally and understandably and heartbreakingly, that they cannot afford to be next? We do not have a number for that. We cannot know. And that uncertainty, that gap between what we know is happening and what we are able to see, is the most important legacy of this story. Not the guilty pleas, not the settlement, not the legislative reforms, as valuable as they were. The most important legacy is the question it forces us to ask about every institution we trust with our lives, and about whether the people inside those institutions, the ones who see the things we cannot see from the outside, are truly free to tell us the truth. Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. If you were Sandra Kowalski, if you had seen what she saw, documented what she documented, been rebuffed by the administration the way she was, and you knew what writing that letter might cost you, would you have written it? There is no wrong answer. There is only the honest one. And the people in this community, I have found, tend to give honest answers. Share this story with someone who deserves to hear it. And if you are not already subscribed, do it now, because the next story we are bringing you is every bit as important as this one.